Welcome to part two of the CACINA 2025 project. This segment is focused on where we are today, and we're calling it CACINA 2019. We figured that before we start determining where we want to go, we need to get a better understanding and get clear on where we are right now. One of the things that we seem to be very clear about is who we are. We seem to have a pretty good sense of our own identity. Bishop Tony Green very recently sent out a survey about words that we associate with CACINA. How do we see ourselves? About 39 people answered that survey, and this is what they said. One word that popped up over and over and over again in people's responses was Catholic. Now, although we didn't define that very heavily, there seemed to be a sense that as a Catholic church, we are sacramental, we are priestly, we are focused on the gospel, and other characteristics like that. We are Catholics in a classic sense, but we have key differences. That was another theme that was very clear in the data, that those differences, primarily the Roman Catholic Church, focus on things like sexuality and justice and our power structures and what have you. We are also, however, very sacramental, very liturgical. The Mass is a key component of our sense of how we relate to God, and as the other sacraments as well. We also heard the words welcome and inclusive over and over and over again in responses. So we see ourselves as a church that bars no one from entry. All are welcome. We also saw ourselves as a church that is focused on social justice and the care of others, and that social justice is not just lip service, it's not just thoughts and prayers, it is actions that we are a church that gets involved. So there seems to be an alignment about what we want to be and who we think we are and how we see ourselves across all of CACINA. We also know extremely well our foundations. We know where we came from, that we were founded in the 40s by Bishop Duarte Costa, who had his own sense of how he should carry out his priestly ministry and his Christian mission. And when he couldn't get alignment with the church because they were more focused on politics and building relationships with the government and what have you, he split from the Roman Catholic Church and began the Apostolic Church in Brazil. And then in the 40s, late 40s, he sent Corrado de Scarella to the United States to begin that same initiative up here in North America. Must have been very difficult at the time, but Scarella came and started what we now know as CACINA, and the rest is history. There's good news there and bad news. The good news is we have clear apostolic succession back to legitimately ordained Catholic bishops. The bad news is that we've been in the United States since 1949, and what happened at the General Assembly this past May, in our small group anyway, is to say, well, what have we done with this? Where have we gone? It's one thing to say, and we should be proud of it, that we have survived this long. But I mean, for something that's been at work for 70 years, what can we say about ourselves? And that's kind of what spurred this project. We are, unlike most independent Catholic churches, extremely well organized. We have a code of canons and a constitution, college of bishops. We have very defined roles of pastors and heads of religious communities. We have a chancellor who acts as the arbiter of the canons. We have a clear definition of the role of the laity. We have a House of Delegates through which many of the laity participate in the governance of the church. We have the General Assembly, which acts as a legislative and administrative guide for the church, or at least that's what it's supposed to do, and we have an executive committee. We're also not broke. We have some money in the bank, $17,000. What we don't seem to have, however, is any sense of whether or not that's appropriate for an organization that's been around for 70 years. We don't seem to have an ability to fund our national church from the parishes, and that's probably has something to do with the fact that maybe they don't see any value in that. But there's a lot we could do here to get our financial house in order, as a minimum to exhibit certain corporate controls like publishing balance sheets, income statements, cash flow statements on a regular basis, and then to really focus on how we can how we can raise money. But this is what we have right now today. We have relationships with a number of other organizations. You can see them listed there. It's something we don't talk much about, and we don't seem to leverage very heavily. But nonetheless, we have some sorts of agreements with these groups. And we have some clear-cut national from programs at the national level. The national charity this year, it's Sandy Hook Promise, the Cemetery Markers Program, which was the subject of some spirited discussion at the last GA. Service awards, which happen every year for people that have worked hard on the part of CACINA. The St. Charles Institute for Clergy Formation, which is a clear differentiator. It's a marvelous thing that we have that. Our clergy, as a result, is in much better shape than many independent Catholic churches can claim. And then we have initiatives like the protection of youth and vulnerable people. A lot of work was done on that by a number of folks. I don't believe the policy is still yet published, although I know that Bishop Theogene is beginning to implement parts of it by having all of us who are in leadership positions become certified as designated reporters. We also have done outreach. I mean, everybody in the church, most parishes have websites or Facebook pages, so is the National Church. And the same thing is true for newsletters. We have varying quality in these, but nonetheless, we have newsletters out there as well. This is what we look like in terms of our footprint. We have two dioceses, one in New York with Bishop Frank and one under Bishop Braun in Virginia, and they have split up various congregations and parishes and missions under them. Graphically, we look like this, clustered in the Maryland, from Pennsylvania down into Virginia area, and then up in New York, a little bit in Florida, and then spread out through the rest of the country. But here again, it brings up a question. These technically are our locations, but what does that mean? It's very unclear about how many of these are truly parishes that other people can actually join. It's unclear how many members there are in CACINA, and we know very little about those people who claim to be members of CACINA. So one of the first things CACINA 2025 wants to do as part of CACINA 2019 is to conduct a census and to get a picture of our organization that's clearer than it is right now. It would be things like this. We need to put together a little task force, a little team that would actually conduct interviews across CACINA, and we'd want to know things like how many members do you actually have? What is the definition of a member? How do you formally enroll those members? What other contacts do you have? What's your clerical makeup in terms of those who support the parish? What can you tell us about their ages and genders and former religious affiliations and anything else that you know about them? All the demographics associated with the people that are part of your organization. How involved are they? Could we develop an index to measure that and get some sense of whether or not these truly are action-oriented parishes or not? And for the clergy, some better sense of where they've come from, where they're going, what their current status is, and what have you. As a parish, as a community, or as a religious community, we'd like to understand what are your liturgical practices, what's the average attendance, what's your governance structure, financial condition, what kind of programs do you offer, what kind of communications and advertising do you do. We'd like to also get a sense of how you adhere to the canons of CACINA. We'd like to understand what relationships you have with others, and any kind of issues that you're facing in general. Once we kind of get a picture of that, we would publish a report to the bishops and the HOD and other relevant parties, and then we believe that we ought to maintain an effort to keep these statistics current and accurate records, so we have a picture of what we are. There's a book that's been out about Duarte Costa that estimates that in South America, the Catholic Apostolic Church has about 1 million members. Here we are in North America since 1949, and we have no idea. We want to remedy that. We also have a pretty clear statement of beliefs around things like liturgy and what we believe about the Eucharist. We have a position on infallibility. We have one on freedom of conscience, as I mentioned earlier. This is something that Duarte Costa was very big on. We see ourselves consistent with our identity as a welcoming church, where things like divorce and remarriage do not act as impediments to the sacraments. We respect the same-sex persons and their right to marry. We have a clear understanding of who's invited to holy orders, and that gender is not one of those issues. And we have a sense of reconciliation. We also very clearly state that our belief can be captured and consolidated in the Nicene Creed, which is the ancient creed of the church. And we also state that there are other bases for our belief in the creed, the Apostles' Creed, the Athanasian Creed. These are equally valid and useful, and that we point out several ecumenical councils as councils that we believe said something informative to the church. We specifically leave out some other councils. We leave out Trent. We leave out Vatican I, for example. And if you notice, there's no mention of Vatican II. That sounds good, except there's some issues here. One of the things that we've done when we talk about the Nicene Creed is we omit the Trinitarian doctrine of the filioque. Filioque is a Latin word that means "and the Son." We take it out from the version of the creed that is most familiar with Roman Catholics. Most Roman Catholics would say, "We believe in the Holy Spirit, the Lord and giver of life, who proceeds from the Father and the Son, with the Father and the Son is worshipped and glorified." We've dropped out that "and the Son" from the "who proceeds from the Father" sentence. When I've asked about that, I hear that we did it for apparently two reasons. Because some say that the early church never had it in there in the first place, and the Son was added later, so dropping it is more authentic Christian doctrine. And the second big reason I hear is that the singular Orthodox Christians that they'd be welcome here. Here's the issue. We say that these other creeds are equally useful, and valid. Yet the Athanasian Creed clearly has the filioque in it. There's the Latin words actually from the document, Spiritus Sanctus et Patria Filio non factus ne creatus ne genitus sed procedens. That translates as, the Holy Spirit from the Father and the Son was neither made nor created nor begotten, but proceeds. That is exactly the same sentence as, who proceeds from the Father and the Son. So there's an issue with this kind of stuff. We do these things, I don't think we think them through. First of all, the filioque was in fact fairly widespread, yes, in the West, but also in the East, in the 2 and 3, the decades, the centuries of the 3rd century and the 4th century, as well as in the 2nd century. They were clearly talked about there. Many of the early doctors and writers espoused this view of the Trinity prior to it being inserted in the Nicene Creed. Origen mentions it in something like 269 AD. Tertullian, about the same era. Maximum the Confessor, Hilary of Poitiers. Now you're getting into the 300s. Epiphanius, Basil. These are all people that are contemporaneous with the Nicene Council, as well as the early church, and they clearly talk about the Spirit proceeding from Father and Son, and lots of reasons why they say that. It's so much so that even today, many Orthodox leaders don't see this as a substantive issue. So why are we making it one for CACINA? Why do we do things like this? Because I believe it adds no benefit, and it actually has some downsides. One downside is the fact that we endorse two opposing Trinitarian doctrines just makes us look silly. We look like theological amateurs, and we lose credibility. So again, why would we do it? What's the rationale for introducing an element of change in order to accommodate Orthodox Christians who are in no way, shape, or form our target market? Meanwhile, they add confusion to those who are our target market, which are Roman Catholics. It's an esoteric change that I've witnessed when new people come to our congregations and they get to that part in the creed. A few of the CACINA people will not say "and the Son," but the new folks, the new Roman Catholics, just plow right on through it because that's what they're used to and that's what they're changed. So it's the kind of thing that if we're going to grow this church, we got to get clear about what we're really saying here and what really is important. We differ from the Roman Catholic Church in some areas. Why do we have to bring up these kinds of things that just seem so esoteric and meaningless and actually could have negative downsides to them? So that's just something I think we got to take a look at, along with our census and other things. We got to clean up our act and figure out, what it means to, if we're going to go after disenfranchised Catholics. They'll put all that together in what commercial organizations would understand as the SWOT analysis: strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. If we kind of keep this in mind, it'll help shape where we're going, because it'll enable us to focus on leveraging our strengths, acknowledging and minimizing our weaknesses, seizing opportunities, and dealing with threats that occur as we try to bring about this substantive change of a new and growing CACINA. I think our strengths are, as you heard in the survey from Bishop Green, our inclusiveness. We are a welcoming church. We bar no one, and we've been around for 70 years. We should be proud of that. We are certainly a unique alternative to the Catholic Church, and we're unique among the independent churches in that we're much better organized in what we do. We have a national presence, we have a little bit of money, we have no debt or overhead, we clearly focus on Catholic liturgy and Catholic traditions, and we have an engaged and fairly well-trained and very devoted clergy. Where we're weak is we have very little growth. We have no outreach programs that I know of, not really that are any that seem to be serious. We are totally unknown to most people. We have weak finances, and that's a bit of a vicious cycle because we have so little money, we can't do much in the way of outreach, and therefore that's why we don't have any money, and that means we can't do anything for outreach. So we got to break up this cycle somehow. That, in effect, has also created this phenomena where I see very little in the way of young people or families with kids in our churches. There's not much in the way of adult education or instruction or the development of discipleship. Lay ministry is not well organized in most of our places. We don't have any clear goals or planning, which is what CACINA 2025 is going to try to fix. We have no plan to recruit or let alone integrate new people when they show up. Limited interest in the parishioners to invest time and effort, probably because of these other things that are happening. And then finally, we're labeled as independent Catholics, which for many, many people has a really, really horrible reputation as being a bunch of disorganized, kind of little wacko organizations out there. We've got that label, and I know there's some discussion about getting rid of it and not calling ourselves that. But if that's the case, we got to get clear about what we're going to call ourselves and how we're going to differentiate ourselves from all the crazier groups that are around. Because we have a huge opportunity, which is that next bucket. We've talked about the growing disillusionment with the Roman Catholic Church and other churches, the desire for a church that is open to women's leadership, divorced people, gay people, etc. Lots of people searching for values and belonging, and that we're losing to the fundamentalists and others because they seem to have answers. And here we are, and so that's an opportunity. And we just happen to be doing this at a time and place in history with as many low-cost sources to communicate, get the word out, and what have you, like the internet. The threats, on the other hand, we have emerging megachurches everywhere that can conduct elaborate productions. They're highly popular. They got deep pockets. Some of them are disgustingly rich. Well, they're out there. They're in the same marketplace as we are. Overall, there's failing interest in religion in general, although it's not as rapid and as widespread according to some Pew Research studies that have been done as one might think. Clearly it is, and the fundamentalist churches, some of these things you see on TV, indicate that people seem to want an emotional experience. They want to be entertained rather than to be challenged, and that's a bit of an issue that we'd have to deal with. Overall, the country is divided. We ourselves have clergy, but it's an aging clergy. There's not really a young population to come in and replace those of us who aren't going to be here in 5 to 10 years. There's resistance to change in general, which we'd have to deal with, and there's little time for the principals to actually do something about it. So that's kind of where we're at today, and where we want to go, which is part 3 and coming up, is how to fix some of this stuff, how to seize on the SWOT and utilize some of these strengths and some of these to pursue some of these opportunities and fix some of the weaknesses and deal with some of the threats. So stay tuned. I invite you to go on to section 3. also are a number of moral stances that would help shape our messages to a number of the people we're talking about, that we say nothing about some of these things, at least not in our public materials. It may be preached from the pulpit from time to time, but it's not in our public documents. For example, we don't really say a lot about how we're working to help the poor, the disaffected, or the disenfranchised. I think of people looking for a path to discipleship back in a church that is active and that is taking the gospel seriously. We'd want to hear about that. We say nothing about the rights of women or abortion. There are an awful lot of Catholics who are fed up with Roman Catholic preaching around these topics, and yet we don't really say anything affirmative about them. Stewardship of the planet, war and peace, and then the overall issue of discipleship itself and what does that mean for us. So I think we've got some work to do in making sure that we've clarified where we stand on some things, because it's the kind of stuff new people that are in our target market are going to be looking for. Same thing with theology. We need to say more about sacraments. We don't say much about baptism and what we think of it, or confirmation and what we think of it. We don't talk about the sacraments of the sick and sacraments of healing or last rites or any of that sort of stuff. We say a little bit about the Eucharist, but we don't really expound on how central the Eucharist is for us. And by extension, we don't talk much about priests and the fact that we are a priestly church. We are not some other experiments that are going on with Christian communities. We are a priestly church, a hierarchical church, and we value our clergy. We don't say much about it. We don't really talk aggressively about how we're evangelizing, nor do we say much about how we build prayer. And then when it comes to the basis of belief, although we mentioned creeds that I just talked about, we don't say anything about the centrality and the role and the importance of Scripture and what we think about that. We're not fundamentalists, for example, and we should say something about how we understand Scripture. We have no mention of Catholic tradition, particularly the writings of the fathers and the doctors of the Church, and even less about contemporary theological discourse that is not from the fathers and the doctors, but everything from Aquinas on out, from Augustine on out, to Desjardins and Paul Tillich and so many others that are there. We seem to have glommed onto a few people like Richard Rohr, but all these other folks that are out there we say nothing about. There's no discussion about it. It doesn't enter our discussions. And then finally, we say nothing about Vatican II. Even though we claim that our liturgies adhere to the sacramentary of Vatican II. So I think if we're going to do this, we've got to say, what is the role of Vatican II? My suspicion is that Duarte Costa was around when Vatican II started. We might not have left the church, because a lot of what he was looking for, I think he would find others, people who would support him, other bishops who would support him, and actually we would have gotten some of the things he accomplished that he wanted to get accomplished. Things like, for example, having his liturgy in Portuguese, or in the native Indian languages of South America. So anyway, I think here again we could strengthen our position so that when people come and look at us, they say, wow, this is the place.